That's too loud?
Yeah,
How's
that one
that?
gets really loud.
How's that one? Better?
You want to open her mic?
All right,
and
Veronica,
check
you're
it
going to
real
be
quick?
part of this today. So
awesome.
you made it happen, and so you're going to join the discussion. We're going to have all the mics open. Let me get it going, and we'll find a pace and stuff, and then join in. And then Ross, that microphone, you want to go right up to it, as close as you can, and you can pull at it. All right, are we all set here?
Yeah, go ahead and mute the mics.
Okay. Muting the mics.
And we're good.
Okay.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hey everybody, welcome to this Patreon episode of Addressing Gettysburg, and today I am pretty certain that we're going to have an interesting show for you. First of all, let me introduce someone to you who you've heard me refer to on many shows before, but it's always this voice off in the distance. But today I told her, Veronica, you are instrumental in making this show happen. So you must speak, and this is the great defense attorney, Veronica Brostensky. Hello, Veronica.
Hi, Matt.
You forgot the Esquire at the end.
Oh, the Esquire. I'm sorry, Veronica Brostensky, Esquire.
Paid a lot of money for that, you know.
Absolutely.
A lot of debt for that, right?
Right.
So Veronica, you came to me one time and you said, I got a guy that you need to have on this show. And then I guess you talked to Eric, and we made it happen, and here we are. So why don't you introduce our guest today? Tell us all, tell the audience why you thought he would be a good guest, and introduce him.
Okay. Thank you. I'm excited to do this.
Good.
So our guest today is Ross Hetrick. He is the president of the Thaddeus Steven Society. That's actually located right here in Gettysburg, and I'm going to defer to Ross to give us a little bit more of a explanation about what exactly the Thaddeus Steven Society does and stands for and tries to advocate for. But I was honored enough to, with my mom, actually, we went at Ross's invitation. As members of the society, he allowed us to come look at the just amazing memorabilia and museum, really, that he owns and controls, again, right here in Gettysburg.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to talking, and he was kind enough and generous enough to say any opportunity to advocate for a little bit more exposure and awareness of Thaddeus Stevens is right up his alley. So he agreed generously to come on the show, and I'm ecstatic to have him on here.
I know you bought pizza and everything.
Well, yeah, that doesn't take too much effort. There's not too much food I would not use an excuse to get. But
Yeah. Okay, well, so Ross, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. You said it was very generous of me to come to the show. And I have to say, I will talk about Thaddeus Stevens at the drop of a hat.
Yes.
In fact, I have accosted people who say, I don't know who Thaddeus Stevens is. And I say, let me tell you who Thaddeus Stevens is. And then about an hour later, they'll run away.
Well, we don't run away from that. We'd like to learn on this show, and so I'm glad that you're here. Thaddeus Stevens, a lot of people, I would imagine, people my age, younger, their first real interaction with Thaddeus Stevens is from the movie Lincoln with Tommy Lee Jones playing him.
Yes.
So let's start with that then, since that's probably the common ground we all have to jump off from. The portrayal of Thaddeus Stevens in Lincoln, good, bad?
Good for his reputation. Lots of problems factually.
Go, give us some.
Well, perhaps the two most the two most infactual ones is where Tommy Lee Jones, as Thaddeus Stevens, jumps into bed with his Black Mistress at the end of the approval of the 13th Amendment. That did not happen. Mm-hmm. The housekeeper that was supposedly was his mistress, which is not true either, was not even in Washington on that day. In fact, the person who wrote it, Tony Kushner, admits as much, and he basically said it was just for dramatic
Right.
license.
So because I know a lot of people take that to be gospel. I hear people say this, that he, had this
Black Mistress.
Yeah. Now, so who is she supposed to be?
She is supposed to be Lydia Hamilton Smith.
And she's from this area?
Well, she actually grew up in this area at two taverns in this area outside of Gettysburg. And she was hired by Thaddeus Stevens as his housekeeper in 1848 and served as his housekeeper until he died in 1868. And while there's no denying that they were friends, and she did more than just housekeeping, she also helped him with his business operations, such as buying properties and such like that. There is no evidence that she was romantically involved.
Now,
with him.
before the movie Lincoln, was this a thing? Or
Yes,
is this
it
something?
was-
Okay,
it
so
was a
where does this
thing.
come from?
This is an interesting thing, because he treated her with respect, because she was his employee,
Right.
Instead of just calling her by her first name, he did ask people to call her Mrs. Smith, to show, and that to treat her like an adult. And because of this, and because Thaddeus Stevens was roundly attacked by the conservatives, by Confederates and such like that, that was a political attack that she was his mistress.
I had a feeling you were going to say that. Okay.
And to tell you the truth, probably she was only a quarter black, so probably if she had been all white, it probably wouldn't have been brought up.
Right.
But she was used back then to as an attack on Thaddeus Stevens, which he denied at the time. And there were also various other things, like the fact that she was a devout Catholic, and devout Catholics at that time.
Oh, that's the worst. That's the worst.
Didn't go in for adultery, and also she had her sons living with her in the house at the time, which also is kind of strange.
Was she a widow?
She was a widow.
Taking it.
She was a widow. And so all those different reasons, and particularly because he denied it, there really isn't any proof. There's no love letters or anything like that. Now, it's interesting that now the relationship between Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith is being used to make him more politically correct.
Right. So basically, they have him getting into bed with her. Now it's being portrayed as a good thing and not a bad thing. So it's just like the tables have turned.
The tables have turned.
Yeah. So symbolically, it's saying that we as a society accept that now.
Right.
And it's like, it's no big deal. So what if he did, even though he didn't?
Well, they didn't talk about it. I can't say for certain.
Right.
My feeling is I'll take him at his word that he didn't have it, and that there wasn't any. There were various things that would have mitigated against it, like the sons living with them and her being a devout Catholic. And she is buried in consecrated ground in Lancaster. So I don't think the Catholic Church at that time was much into, burying adulterers.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess neither one of them would have left behind any written evidence of
No, neither one.
Anything going on.
I mean, neither of them did.
No, not that they did, but they wouldn't have.
Right, probably.
Right, because
they probably kept better secrets back then.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so then who was Thaddeus Stevens before Lincoln? Before the movie Lincoln, who was Thaddeus Stevens? Where's he from? What's his connection to Gettysburg? All that jazz.
Okay. Well, first off, I'd like to say that to make him accessible to people, I have two names for him. I call him the greatest unknown person in American history, and also the 17th and a half president, because he led a veto-proof Congress against Andrew Johnson. If you wanted to get anything done between 1865, after Lincoln was assassinated, and 1868, you had to go through Thaddeus Stevens. Okay. He was the guy who was in control of the House of Representatives, and as such, basically set the agenda for what was being done. Now, Thaddeus Stevens lived in two places. One was, actually, he lived in a number of places. He was originally born in Vermont, moved down to Pennsylvania, was in New York for a couple years, got his law degree. He then came over here to Gettysburg and was here from 1816 to 1842. And during that time, he also was an iron master, which was kind of bizarre for a politician. And that actually led him to go $200,000 in debt, which spurred him to leave Gettysburg and move over to Lancaster, where he could make more money as an attorney and pay down his debt. Also, he was a member of the House of Representatives in the state legislature here when he was in Gettysburg. And he was a fierce advocate of education as well as being against slavery. The two important things he did during that time was, one, he gave a speech in 1835 which turned back a repeal effort of education, which earned him the title of Father of Public Education in Pennsylvania. And then he also sat on a constitutional convention in 1837 where he refused to sign the finished product because it denied black men the right to vote, which had sort of been given before that. So then he went on in 1842, went over to Lancaster, where he was elected to Congress from 1848 to 1852. And then he lost his position, but came roaring back in 1858 as a Republican. And he stayed in Congress from 1858 to 1868. And this is an amazing time because he was like 66 years old when he was elected. So it gives me a lot of hope. Gives me a lot of hope for being able to accomplish something in my later years. But he was 10 years that he just was a tremendous force in our nation's history. If he had died at age 66, we wouldn't have really heard about him.
Right. Okay.
And he was so intent in his efforts that in the last 5 years, he was like slowly dying and actually had to be carried in to Congress to pursue his efforts. And what he did during that time, during Lincoln's administration, he and other abolitionists or so-called radical Republicans pushed as hard as they could on Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And then Thaddeus Stevens was the first to put in for a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery, which Lincoln joined about a year after he put in the initial resolution, which is sort of portrayed in the Lincoln movie.
Right.
By the way, just sort of going back to the Lincoln movie, the other thing that was outrageous about that was that Lincoln is giving Thaddeus Stevens political suggestions, whereas Thaddeus Stevens was the greatest parliamentary leader.
He didn't need Lincoln's help.
He didn't need Lincoln's help.
Yeah.
It was the other way around.
Yeah.
And so, in any case, but the movie was great because it was much better than the two previous movies made about Thaddeus Stevens, where Thaddeus Stevens was the villain. But getting back to what he did during the Lincoln administration, he was very instrumental in pushing Lincoln to take more and more positions for emancipation, for abolition, and so on. And in fact, Lincoln at the very end was for granting voting by black men who were in the Army or who were very educated, as he said. And a lot of that was because of the pressure from people like Thaddeus Stevens in Congress. More importantly, after Lincoln was assassinated, basically, Thaddeus Stevens was responsible from keeping Johnson from losing the war after the war.
Reconstruction.
Right. Well, Reconstruction was the alternative to what Johnson was proposing.
Gotcha.
And what Johnson originally proposed was just to let the planter elites to come back into power. If you have time, let me tell you about an incredible turning point in American history, which is December 4th, 1865, which, are you familiar with that? No.
I don't think so.
It should be a holiday.
Okay.
It is, as I call it, the day that Thaddeus Stevens and Edward McPherson saved the country.
Okay.
And what happened is after Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, there was a period of time that Congress was not in session. We have to understand Congress was not in session all the time. It is like
I know.
today.
It was the good old days.
The good old days. It was only in for a couple months and then it left. So
Right.
there was this period from April until December where Johnson had free reign to do whatever he wanted. And Johnson was a Southern Democrat. And so while he was against the session, he wasn't against the general way that the South ran. And in particular, he was not very sympathetic towards freed blacks.
Uh-huh.
And so he actually allowed the Southerners to hold elections. And they elected Confederate officials, Confederate generals and colonels. Alexander Stevens, the vice president of the Confederacy, was elected to the Senate.
Right, yeah.
And if these people had taken their seats, they would have been able to join up with their Democratic allies in the North and taken over the Congress. And with Johnson as president, they actually wanted the federal government to pay their war debt. Okay, they were just so arrogant. They wanted us to pay for their war.
It's amazing that after 4 years of something that has evidently changed the country, that there were people that think you could just go back in and act as if those 4 years didn't happen and go back and just pick up from where you left off.
Right. And in fact, and they also, even worse than that, they were going to reinstate slavery. And you said, how could they do?
Are you serious?
Serious.
I never heard
serious.
that. Oh, my
yeah.
God.
What happened was the 13th Amendment was passed. And you said, well, of course, but there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment.
Of course.
It says involuntary servitude is prohibited except for convict labor.
Oh.
For being convicts.
Oh.
So they just said, okay, fine, we'll just make all free blacks convicts. And they did that by saying, if you're, a free black and you say, oh, I'm free, I'll, leave my plantation. You're mad at the entrance by the sheriff, said, hey, you got a job? No, I don't have a job. I just got out of being a slave. Said, well, that's too bad. You're a vagrant. And you have and these were called the black codes.
The black codes,
because they only applied to blacks. There was no 14th Amendment requiring equal treatment.
So
it's
required you have a job if you're black.
Right.
Not if you're white.
Not if you're white.
Right. If you're black, then it's vagrancy, and then we arrest you and convict you, and now you're on the chain gang, basically.
Well, you're
actually
they put you back on the plantation as convict labor.
Okay.
They make contracts with the planters.
Oh, all right.
And do that. So they had all these codes basically hemming in all of the freed blacks into this sort of institutionalized slavery. And, of course, so this was what was going to happen if the Southerners actually took their seats. Mm-hmm. But Thaddeus Stevens was going to let that happen as the most powerful congressman in Congress at that time. In fact, his detractors called him the dictator of the House. The Republican caucus came up with a plan. And it involved, interestingly enough, Edward McPherson, who was from Gettysburg. And he was a protege of Thaddeus Stevens. Had worked.
He owned McPherson's farm.
McPherson's farm, and also there's a McPherson house at the corner of Carlisle and Stevens Street. Mm-hmm. In any case, so Edward McPherson was the clerk of the House at that time, a position that Thaddeus Stevens got him. And just like every other session of Congress, he started calling out the roll, and he got to the Southern names, and he skipped them, didn't call them out. The Southerners and their Democratic allies, or Northern Democratic allies, started jumping up and down and saying, you can't do that, you can't do that. Thaddeus Stevens got up and said, point of order, we can discuss no business until the roll is called. The roll was called, the Southerners were out, and that was the beginning of Reconstruction, because essentially you just had Northern congressmen in control of Congress. There were no Southerners. In fact, that's as a result of that, they imposed military districts on the South. And that was sort of led to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, because the Congress was able to routinely override his veto. In fact, that was just sort of like the way they did things during Johnson's administration. But of course, under our system, the president has to implement the legislation, and he kept trying to sabotage Reconstruction efforts. And it came to a head when he tried to get rid of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and that resulted in his impeachment, and he escaped conviction by one vote. So that was the important thing. And because of what Thaddeus Stevens did during that time, you did have Reconstruction, and you also had the passage of perhaps the most important amendment to the Constitution, which is the 14th Amendment, which really I call Thaddeus Stevens the father of the 14th Amendment. He introduced the initial structure of the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment, for the first time in our history, required equal treatment under the law. Even though the Declaration of Independence talks about all men are created equal, that didn't happen, as you well know, before the 14th Amendment. In fact, a lot of people don't realize that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states before the 14th Amendment.
Interesting.
It only, in fact, there was no freedom of the press in the South before the Civil War. There were laws outlawing the distribution of abolitionist material. In fact, they would go out and rob the mails and burn abolitionist material to prevent it from getting into the hands of people down in the South.
Amazing.
So these are, in my feeling, is that we live more. In fact, you could say, and I'll finish this up, that Thaddeus Stevens was one of the founders of the second founding of the United States.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And we live more in Thaddeus Stevens' world than in James Madison's world.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. So, what made him so powerful? Like, how did he get so powerful? What was his right? He was a lawyer. He was a teacher. You said first, right?
Right, teacher and then a lawyer.
And he's a lawyer in this area. He has an office in Gettysburg at some point.
That's true. Yeah. Well, he was a lawyer in Gettysburg from 1816 to 1842.
And then moved to Lancaster.
Right.
Okay.
He was like a super lawyer in Pennsylvania.
He was like the Johnny Cochran.
Oh, absolutely. If you wanted to get something done, legal or illegal, in Pennsylvania, you see Thaddeus Stevens.
Okay. Wait, that's a loaded statement there. We want to get something done legal or illegal. Give me an example of what he would help you with that's illegal.
Okay. Maybe I was too quick to say that, but I'm just trying to think of something that he did. Well, there's an example in one of the books about where he was defending a person who was accused of stealing a cow.
Okay.
Yeah, and as it was recounted to me, the witness who saw this guy take a cow, he basically cross-examined him on the coloring of the cow, to the point that the guy couldn't really figure out whether he'd actually seen that cow stolen or not. So
he was he was at least if we're to believe Tommy Lee Jones's portrayal of him, pretty good with sarcasm.
Oh, tremendous. He was actually one of the funniest congressmen in U.S. history. As the Thaddeus Steven Society, we put out a little joke book.
Now, I know. I noticed that you have a joke book. You have it here, Veronica?
Right.
Yeah, there's a little Thaddeus Stevens. Go ahead.
Let me give you a couple of examples.
Go ahead.
One actually involved another prominent Pennsylvania politician, Simon Cameron. Simon Cameron, who was the first Secretary of the War under Lincoln, until he found out that he was a crook. went to Thaddeus Stevens early in the administration and said, well, how honest do you think Simon Cameron is? And Thaddeus Stevens says, well, you wouldn't steal a red-hot stove. And so Lincoln thought that was a pretty funny joke. And so he told Simon Cameron, which wasn't too smart. And Simon Cameron, got all upset and demanded that Thaddeus Stevens retract it. So Thaddeus Stevens went back to Lincoln and said, well, you know how I said that he would steal a red-hot stove? And Lincoln said, yes. And he says, well, I was wrong. And another famous one is he's walking down a narrow sidewalk in Lancaster, and a political enemy is coming up the other side, and the political enemy glowers at him and says, I never stand aside for a skunk. And Thaddeus Stevens stepped off the curb and says, but I always do.
That's a good one.
This is a great audience. I like your...
Here, I like this is from your book. It's from the Thaddeus Steven Society puts this out, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but you compiled it.
Right.
It's called Our Damn Rascal, The Wit and Wisdom of Thaddeus Stevens. This is under a heading called Feebleness. A member of Congress would often affect great humility and a low estimate of his comments, even though he continued to inflict the House with them. On one occasion, he was anxious for Stevens to yield to him so that he brandished his false modesty again. Anticipating this, Stevens said, I now yield to my colleague who will make a few feeble remarks. I like that.
He had also, actually, there are things in one biography that talks about how the clerk of the House, who was recording all these different things, would make notations that there would be peals of laughter around Thaddeus Stevens while Congress was in session. So he was sort of like the class cut-up. In fact, you're talking about that feeble remarks thing. There was one other person who would pace back and forth all the time, and he made the comment, he says, I hope he's not going to charge mileage.
There's one here, just a little thing. He had alopecia.
Right.
So people listening that might have alopecia, Thaddeus Stevens is one of you. He is he had it too, and look what he did. He wore a wig. So the thing with him, wasn't there something about the wig, wearing a wig?
In the movie, or are you talking about the joke? About the joke with the wig?
Yeah, it could be both.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's the famous one was where a woman came up to him and said, oh, Mr. Stevens, I really admire you. Can I have a lock of your hair? And he took his wig off and said, have the whole thing.
And what about he's being accused of being in contempt of court?
Actually, that's interesting. I was just talking about that today with somebody. It was a joke which was stolen by Mae West.
Oh.
Okay. And what the situation was that Thaddeus Stevens was in court, and the judge was making a lot of rulings that he didn't like with, and he was sort of grumbling under his breath. And the judge says, are you showing contempt for the court, Mr. Stevens? And he says, no, I'm trying to hide it.
Yes, I'm doing my best to conceal it.
Yeah, and that actually was a joke used in My Little Chickadee with Mae West.
Okay.
So I assume that she stole it from Thaddeus Stevens. Maybe somebody else stole it, and then she stole it from them or something like that. But let me tell you what, this is not in our joke book about a court case where Thaddeus Stevens, you were talking about legal versus illegal. He was in a court case where he was a doctor, say Dr. Jones was accused of malpractice, and he was kind of a quack. Thaddeus Stevens was representing him. And Thaddeus Stevens, trying to confuse the jury, kept substituting the name Dr. Smith, who was a respected doctor in the community. And he kept on talking about Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, and so on and so forth. Well, during the trial, this got back to Dr. Smith, and Dr. Smith was outraged, and he took up a whip, and he was going to go down there and whip Thaddeus Stevens. And as he went down there, a crowd gathered around to see this whipping of Thaddeus Stevens. And so the trial just ended, and Thaddeus Stevens comes down the steps, And Dr. Smith, says, I understand you were confusing me with Dr. Jones. And Thaddeus says, oh, I am so sorry. I'll immediately go apologize to Dr. Jones. and the story goes that everybody started laughing so much that he got out of the whipping.
Yeah, laughter, man. It works.
He was incredibly. I mean, he's the type of person. We all know people who just come up with the right thing at the right time, and he was one of those people.
Yeah. And, especially self-deprecating humor.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to bring a humor to diffuse a situation, but when it's self-deprecating, and how could the guy still hate you when you're making a joke at your own expense? And, he served on Borough Council in Gettysburg.
Yes, he did for 6 years.
See, now that is something, because I don't think we've had anybody remarkable on council since.
I would say, unless someone can bring up a different person, he is the most famous person to have served on Borough Council in Gettysburg.
I mean, I don't know, but the first famous person I've heard of that served on council. So who knows?
Interesting enough, just to go back to a question you had about how he managed to do this. This is kind of the incredible thing about Thaddeus Stevens. He was not Speaker of the House, okay? Mm-hmm. He, though he exercised as much power or more power than the Speaker of the House. I think nowadays we would call him the majority whip. But some people, I've heard people talk about how he was able to do this just by the sheer force of his personality. And there were just a number of, there are actually two occasions which I call cinematic moments in Thaddeus Stevens' life. When I say cinematic moments, talk about where in the movies where somebody like Jimmy Stewart gets up and makes a speech and everybody says, oh, we've seen the light, we all agree with you, even though they were all against him initially. And he did this twice, once in 1835, where, like I said, there was a repeal effort of public education, which actually passed the state Senate, came over to the state House. He made his speech where he said, make not your monuments of brass and marble, but of ever-living mind. Mm-hmm. And that turned the tide, and the House passed a stronger public education bill, which was then approved by the Senate, which had just approved a repeal. So the other cinematic moment was in 1867 when they were discussing or considering the Reconstruction Acts putting military control on the South, and it looked like it was going to go down. And Thaddeus Stevens came into the House, had to be carried in. He was such a feeble voice that everybody had to crowd around him to hear it. But it was such a powerful speech that they voted for it, and it passed and went on to be, policy of the United States. So it wasn't purely because of position, but it was just because he was the head of the Radical Republicans, which was a minority inside the Republican Party, but they were very disciplined and very committed, and they basically carried the day during that period of time.
So when he was working on, back when he was in Pennsylvania, and he was working with the governor on education and all that stuff.
Right, Governor Wolf.
Governor Wolf, that's what I was getting at. We've had two Governor Wolves?
Yeah, sure.
Who knew? Who knew? Here, we just learned a new thing. Okay, so one of the things he does when he has his successful law practice as the Johnny Cochran of South Central Pennsylvania is he starts investing in property.
Lots of property.
Lots of property.
He was like the largest property owner in Gettysburg in the 1830s. Okay.
By the time of the battle, is he still a pretty big holder of properties? I mean,
not as much in Gettysburg.
Okay.
He went over to Lancaster and was investing in properties over there. He was always sort of a speculator, but he still continued to own properties. In fact, he owned the house that became Robert E. Lee's headquarters during the battle.
Mrs. Thompson.
Mrs. Thompson. He basically bought that from Mrs. Thompson and let her live there at a very reasonable, if any, rent. He was very famous for his generosity.
you would think, just from what I know of him superficially, with the sarcasm, he's a hard fighter. He seems like a cantankerous kind of guy, no bullshit kind of guy.
Oh yeah,
right. And
you can say that here. Huh?
Yeah, you can say that here. And you would think that most people that are like that really don't have a tender heart to them, but it sounds like he does. Like he, what he did for Mrs. Thompson, like he bought the house and, so that she'd have a place to live. She was a widow, right?
Right.
And then with education and all these things, like he seems to have good ideas, but there's a heart behind him. If you know what I'm saying,
like, well, in fact, it was said about him that he felt like all the cruelties in the world were inflicted against him personally, and
Why does he say that?
Well, in other words, he felt like it was up to him to try to remedy,
because he had an empathy for all those things. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's not bad. So yeah, he's a fascinating guy, Veronica, don't you think?
He is. I don't know nearly a tenth of what Ross obviously knows about him, but I've always been fascinated by him as a politician, as an abolitionist, anti-slavery leader. Ross turned me on to this most recent publication by Bruce Levine. It's a Thaddeus Stevens biography that kind of touches a little bit on the political aspect of his life. And it focuses a little bit more on even his upbringing, and I think Ross can talk about that a little bit more. But you talked about his alopecia.
Mm-hmm.
He had a club foot.
Yeah.
There were some other things that I think maybe put him in touch with a little bit more of empathy towards others, and
being kind of like a outcast or a freak, feeling like a freak.
Perhaps, perhaps a little bit.
Not that people with club feet and alopecia are freaks, but I'm saying he was probably treated like one.
He was.
Yeah,
he was.
Okay, we'll go into that. Yeah.
Well, at the time that he had a club foot, that was seen as a secret mark of the devil. That it was some sort of infliction on a family because they had done something wrong.
Because he's born in the 1790s, right?
Right, 1792.
Okay.
In the last term of George Washington.
Wow.
So he really spanned a lot of American history.
Yeah.
And so
it's amazing.
So he was born into a farming family. He had three brothers. His older brother had 2 club feet, which makes it kind of difficult to understand how he could even walk.
Yeah.
But his father abandoned the family when he was 12 years old. And so his mother, had to work twice as hard, and she was a great believer in education, and actually moved from Danville, Vermont to Peacham, Vermont, so he would be closer to the academy that was in Peacham, so he could get a good education. And he went on to be, to attend Dartmouth College and graduate at the top of his class. And then he came down to Gettysburg, or actually came down to York, and then he came down to Gettysburg. So, having a deformity probably did make him more sympathetic. But I think, it's interesting, the new book, a lot of it says is because of the political environment of Vermont, which was very egalitarian. It was also like the first state to actually outlaw slavery, and it had a history of battles between landlords and renters and such like that. And also his mother was a Baptist, so there was sort of that influence in his life also. Though his connection to religion was not that strong. He was, there's a quote from him where he was saying to a seminary student, he says, "Go out and preach the gospel, but never try to prove them." And he also was known to support a lot of churches. He would pay for pews, but never attend them.
Interesting.
And he also, one time, this is in the joke book also, that some person wrote him saying, "Well, I've been told you are a non-believer." And he says, "Oh, only an idiot doesn't believe in God. And I also believe in hell, particularly for that libeler." So he, I think, in my estimation, he also had some tendencies when he was growing up to be sort of a self-made man. And a lot of times self-made men tend to be, well, if I can do it, anybody can do it. And he actually made a speech at Dartmouth where he basically said that poverty was a good thing because it sort of pushed people into doing, better things. But I think he was also quite an intellectual, and he just coming down to Gettysburg because it was so close to the Mason-Dixon line, and there was so much interaction with slave owners trying to catch their slaves and so on, so that he just saw the evilness of slavery and just reacted to that. I've often sort of wondered, well, people ask, well, why were there people against slavery? I think maybe a better question is, why were there people in favor of slavery?
Yeah, right.
That's pretty obvious because you could make a lot of money that way. But.
Well, you can make a lot of money that way, and it was the world you were born into, so, why change it? You know what I mean? It upsets the order. So, I mean, you could understand why people would be in favor of it with not, the way they're raised. They're not. We look at it today as like, well, those are human beings, but they weren't raised that way back then. So could be.
Well, but the South was connected to the United States, and in the northern part of the United States, and particularly Pennsylvania. I mean, Pennsylvania was able to get rid of slavery here through a gradual process.
Yeah.
Of, basically saying, well, everybody who's a slave now continues to be a slave, but the people who are born after a certain period are no longer slaves. And actually, the South had that option to do it, but instead they had all this money tied up in slaves, and also their whole economy was sort of
too invested.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but just because we got rid of slavery up here doesn't mean that their life was much better in the North than in the South. There was still discrimination. We just had Scott Hancock.
Sure.
We just had him on this morning, and he was basically saying that even if you were freed and you can make a lot of money and you can own property, you're still always a second-class citizen. You're always.
I know Scott, and I don't want to disagree with him, but they didn't run towards the South.
Oh no!
They ran away from the South.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is also in the joke book. The Southerners would love to talk about how slavery was such a great institution.
Oh yeah.
That they were giving Christianity to the slaves, and so Thaddeus Stevens said, well, if you guys really believe this, why don't you let everybody, become slaves? Open it up to everybody.
To your daughters.
And let as he said, let the slaves go free, and the free become slaves. And he said that the Northerners would not interfere with the males, even if. He said that they should have abolition societies for the abolition of freedom. And he says, and you can send stuff through the mails, even if they have illustrations of what he called the implements of happiness, handcuffs, iron yokes, and cat of nine tails. So
I love the sarcasm.
So
he's becoming my new hero, Thaddeus Stevens. I love this guy. I love it. Okay, so keep going.
Well, that's good. Yeah. But anyway, he basically is saying, that it was just full of crap, that, that people preferred slavery.
Yeah.
And this is kind of interesting. And this is sort of a plug for Bruce Levin. I don't know if you've read his previous books, but he's a pretty acclaimed historian. And he wrote a book called The Fall of the House of Dixie. Okay. And one of the things I took away from it was the interesting relationship that slaves had with their masters. And believe it or not, a lot of slave owners felt that the slaves liked being slaves. And this was because a lot of slaves said they liked being slaves because that pleased their masters and kept them from being whipped. You sort of had a choice as a slave. You could be a badass, you probably end up dead pretty fast.
Right. Yeah.
Or you could be,
docile
as a step and fetch type slave.
Yep.
And so the slave owners, in fact, when they issued the Emancipation Proclamation, where the slaves could run off to the Union lines to become free, the slaveholders actually wrote in their diaries and such, they didn't believe the slaves were going to leave. And as it turned out, the ones they thought were the most loyal left first.
They skedaddled.
And of course, there's all these stories about how the mistress of the house would bury her silverware, and when the Yankees come around, the slaves would, hey, there's where the silverware is.
Have you ever seen Malcolm X?
No, I haven't seen the movie.
Great movie, but early on, before he becomes Malcolm X and he's
Right.
Malcolm Little, he has a job as a porter on a train. And there's a scene. Have you seen it, Veronica?
I haven't.
Eric, you? No. There's a scene where, and it's been a while, so I might be getting some details wrong, but there's a scene where he's on the train, and there's this arrogant white guy just talking to him like he's a dog, basically calling him boy and things like that. And he puts on this nice smile and he says, "Yes, sir, I aims to please, and I please to aim, or I please to aim, and aim, whatever, some little thing, right?" And then all of a sudden you see him like whack the guy on the head with a tray and like, beat him up and everything. And then it goes back to him just sitting there with that smile. Like in his head, he's imagining, beating the crap out of this guy, but he puts on the smile and says a nice little thing just to go along to get along. And it kind of reminds me of what you're saying with the slaves that say, "No, I love it," and then the minute they get a chance, they're out of there.
They're out of there.
Yeah. Oh, it's gotta be the worst situation that you could, one of the worst situations you could be in, being a slave.
Yeah,
You're not
definitely.
you're not treated like a human. You're like cattle.
Right. But it's interesting you talk about the Pullman. It's interesting, and this is part of the intimidation, or I guess you could say the marginalization. All of the porters on the Pullman cars were called George, after George Pullman. So, I mean, they didn't even have
They didn't have their own name.
names.
Yeah.
You
You just say George, and any one of them can come.
Right.
Yeah, it's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
Okay, so while the war is going on, what's before all the 13th Amendment stuff and everything, and the war is going on, what's his
role?
What's his role? What's he doing?
Right.
What's his opinion?
Well, his official role was he was the head of Ways and Means Committee, and this is something that was extremely important, but is kind of overlooked because of the bigger things he did with the 13th and 14th Amendment.
Okay.
He essentially revamped the American economy during the Civil War, and he did that for the first time in American history. You had the issuing of federal currency. Before the Civil War, you have coins, and the Constitution actually said you could only issue coins. It doesn't say anything about paper money.
Interesting.
In fact, Thaddeus Stevens was, I was talking about, how he wouldn't let things like ethics get in the way of doing something right.
Right.
He was a big believer in stretching the limits of the Constitution. In fact, he's quoted as saying, "We couldn't do a damn thing if we had to follow the Constitution on everything."
Right.
So they started issuing before the Civil War, and you say that they did have paper money, but it was only issued by banks. That's why they were called bank notes.
Banknotes, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, which was a horrible system because some banks were good, some banks were not so good, and there was actually booklets put out during that time which would show you how the value of different dollars.
Like exchange rate?
Exactly.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was completely crazy. So anyway, during the Civil War, they needed money, so they started printing up, and that was what Thaddeus Stevens got through Congress, was the issuing of paper money. Now you'll say, well, that's kind of iffy to put out paper money, and it is. It can cause a lot of inflation, and in fact, at the same time, the Confederacy needed money, and they issued currency also. However, up here, they had a little bit more sense because they made the currency issued by the Union legal tender, which means people had to accept it. They couldn't reject it. Whereas down in the Confederacy, I guess because they were ruled by free marketers or something like that. It was not legal tender, so they would just reject that and only deal in commodities or in silver or gold.
It's amazing to me because the more from doing the show, the more we learn about how the Confederacy was run.
Very badly.
I can't believe it lasted as long as it did. I really can't. Like, how did it make it past a year? I don't understand. Like, who was running that place? Jeez. Okay, so
they let their own ideology sort of get in their way.
Yes, it is. It's very ideologically driven. Well, really, I mean, the whole states' rights thing even went with them. Like, they couldn't even get together long enough to win a war.
Right.
They couldn't pull their shit together, Yeah,
and that's something that they didn't have so much up in the North. And beyond the paper money thing was that Thaddeus Stevens instituted a national banking system, which is sort of the forerunner of the Federal Reserve. Now, this was something that they tried to do early in the 19th century with the United States Bank, but as Andrew Jackson got rid of that. But Thaddeus Stevens was a big believer in a centralized banking system, and that helped raise money for the war, and also had a very it helped to stabilize the economy in the North. So those things were very important. In fact, it was interesting. In one book I was reading about the war, it was primarily about Lincoln, because pretty much every Civil War book is about Lincoln, about Lincoln and Robert E. Lee.
Right.
And anyway, it was like Lincoln. Then they had a one page said, oh, and by the way, the economy was transformed by Thaddeus Stevens. And that one page, and then it was back to Lincoln.
And Lincoln said, okay.
As I tell audiences sometimes, the Union was blessed with two political geniuses, Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens.
Yeah.
And part of the genius of Lincoln was that he listened to Thaddeus Stevens.
I think I agree with you from what you're telling me here. I mean, he's a fascinating guy. Tell me about the Thaddeus Stevens Society.
Okay. You want to sort of know the origins?
Yeah. Where does it come from? What do you do?
Okay. Well, when I was in college, I started learning about Thaddeus Stevens, and I read a biography of Thaddeus Stevens. And I grew up around Charlottesville, Virginia. And as you may know, having been in Charlottesville, everything's Jefferson.
Yes.
Yeah, everything's
Yes.
Jefferson. And so, when I got a chance in the 80s to go to Lancaster, where Thaddeus Stevens is buried, I thought there would be all sorts of stuff about Thaddeus Stevens. And there was nothing about Thaddeus Stevens.
Yeah.
Nobody knew about his grave, which is one of the most inspirational graves that I've ever come across, was unkempt. It was, basically it was forgotten. And so I sort of vowed at that time in the 80s that someday I was going to found the Thaddeus Steven Society.
Okay.
That was interrupted by 2 decades working as a reporter. But in 1995, I got a chance to take a big buyout from the Sun papers in Baltimore, and I came up to Gettysburg specifically to because Thaddeus Stevens had lived here, and it was a cheaper place to live than Lancaster. And so by 1999, I started the Thaddeus Steven Society because I wanted to promote his memory, doing things like this, appearing on radio, having statues, having seminars, and so on and so forth. And so we started it, and since then we've gone from a membership of 40 initially to now over 200, which includes people living in foreign countries.
Wow.
We have about 6 people one person in Hungary, a couple in England.
No, are these American expats?
No,
or are
they're not.
These are real foreigners.
These are
Wow.
These are real foreigners.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, and a Canadian too.
What is their fascination with him?
Because he is a champion of freedom.
Okay.
I'll give you one example. This was our first international member, and he was an Indian from India.
Okay.
Okay, and in his college, he took a film course where they had Birth of a Nation, where there's a Thaddeus Stevens character who is the villain.
What's that character's name?
Austin Stoneman.
Right.
Okay. And but it's clearly Thaddeus Stevens. I mean, there's no questions that it's Thaddeus Stevens. They got the wig, and they got the club foot. They got everything.
Yeah.
Except for that in this movie, Lillian Gish is his daughter, which is kind of bizarre. But in any case, this Indian, and of course the Ku Klux Klan is the heroes,
Right.
in this movie. And so this Indian saw that movie, and he thought, wow, this guy was the opponent of the Ku Klux Klan. He must be really something, And he found us on the internet. The internet has been great for getting
lot of
people
things.
to know about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And so he joined, and he actually wrote a piece for our newsletter about how Thaddeus Stevens was, in his mind, an international champion of equality and should be known around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you found the society. I take it one of the first points of order was to take care of, not points of order, but the first task was to take care of the grave.
Right.
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 So you did that.
Well, we have the grave has been over the last 20 years. It's overseen by a group. It's called the Shriner Concord Cemetery Foundation, which actually doesn't own the cemetery, which is another long story. The cemetery was actually abandoned years and years ago, and we do contribute quite a bit of money to.
Can't we have them exhumed and taken here? Can we do that?
They're taking better care of it. We don't have to do that. We don't have to take that away.
Well, I mean, I think he just belongs here. Not. Don't you agree?
Nah, not really.
No?
I mean,
Why?
I think. Well.
Why Lancaster? Why do they get to get him?
Well, that's where he last lived.
There's plenty of people that died in Lancaster and they're not buried there. Who wants to stay there?
Well, actually, he died in Washington D.C. But he's not buried down in
But
Washington.
that was a question I wanted to ask you before. Sorry to jump around, but when he was down in Congress, was Lancaster his main residence?
That was his main residence. Okay. Yeah,
gotcha. Continue.
And actually, to tell you the truth, despite my first encounter with Lancaster, there is more feeling towards Thaddeus Stevens than there is in Gettysburg. Let me give you a really terrible example.
Okay.
When we started the Thaddeus Steven Society, one of our members, who is a professional photographer, made a replica of a Thaddeus Stevens portrait, even to the point that it looked like it was actually oil painting.
Okay. Oh yeah.
So it was a nice replica, and so we felt, this would be really appropriate to donate this to Gettysburg Borough Council, where he was the most famous person to be in the Borough Council.
Yeah.
Well, it was brought out, and of the 9 members on Borough Council at the time, none of them knew who Thaddeus Stevens was. Even though you have Stevens Street here, you have Caledonia out there, you have
the Thaddeus Stevens house.
Well, there's really not. Yeah,
on Middle Street, the log cabin.
Actually, that wasn't really uncovered until after 2000.
Oh, okay.
But in any case, there still was a lot of history about Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg, and these people didn't know it. And unfortunately, the only person who did know who he was the town manager, who was a Mason. And Thaddeus Stevens' first political party was the Anti-Masons, which prompted this guy to go on a tirade about Thaddeus Stevens. and which prompted one of the borough councilors to say, was this man a bigot? And they were real reluctant to accept the portrait. And I actually had to do an educational effort to get them to accept it. And
What
then,
year was this?
This was 2000.
Okay, so this is before I moved here. So.
Yeah. and after they did accept it, I'm not going to go into detail, they kind of hid it for the next 15 years. Now, recently, we added a little plaque giving more details about him, and they've moved it out to next to the mayor's office, so it's more visible.
Okay, good.
And I have to say, Gettysburg, now they're going to give us a spot for a Thaddeus Stevens statue.
So you've made progress in 20 years.
Yeah, I think we've made a lot of progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, I am all about Thaddeus Stevens now. This guy is fascinating.
Hey, wait a minute. We
What?
can't get off the. I know you were joking about the burial in Lancaster, but I think I think it would be very appropriate for Ross to talk about the actual epitaph that's on his tombstone.
I got to do that. I got to do that because the cemetery itself is a character in his life. Okay, because he refused to be buried in any segregated cemetery, and this was the only integrated cemetery in Lancaster in 1868. And he actually talks about this in his epitaph, which says, I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules. I have chosen this that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his creator.
You got it word for word. I'm reading it as you're saying it. That's pretty good.
In fact, I usually, when people recite it, I listen very carefully to see if they're getting it right.
Now I'm looking at a picture of his grave too. It's a pretty nice looking.
It's a big grave.
I mean, it's huge, and but it looks like there's like a office building or school or factory or something. Big building, big brick building right behind it. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, actually, there is a school right next door to this cemetery, which is the Fulton Elementary School. Which you're saying, well, why is it
the Thaddeus Stevens? Yeah.
Fulton. I don't know why they exactly.
You're talking about Robert Fulton?
Yeah, the steamboat. Steamboat inventor.
Steamboat Willie.
There was an elementary school just about a block away from there named after Thaddeus Stevens. So they did name a school after Thaddeus Stevens. It's now a senior housing development. It's called the Stevens Senior Center or something to that effect. But talking about Lancaster, getting back, they do have also the Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology, which was founded on a bequest from Thaddeus Stevens. So I would say Lancaster is more into Thaddeus Stevens than Gettysburg is. And in our time, we have had tremendous support from the Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology. They've really helped us, provided places for our events, provided money to us. In fact, I got to tell this little thing. The statue that's going to go up in front of the courthouse here, we got a $1,000 donation from the Alumni Association of the Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology. And it's interesting that fund is made up of money that was left by Thaddeus Stevens. So in essence, we're getting money from Thaddeus Stevens.
That's so cool.
For his
own statue.
Yeah.
So talk about the statue now. We talked about it before when we were eating pizza, but now that we're on the microphones, tell everybody about what they could look forward to in April of 2022.
Oh, April 22 will be a big Thaddeus Stevens fest.
Here in Gettysburg.
In Gettysburg, in
Lancaster.
And in Caledonia. We're going to start off on Friday, April the 1st in Lancaster. And of course, we're still in the planning stages. We're just starting because it's a year away.
Yeah.
It's going to be which coincides with the dedication of the statue and also Thaddeus Stevens' 230th birthday. So we're going to start off in Lancaster with seminars, banquets, tours of the restoration of his house, hopefully a light show at his graveyard.
Now, what is that? A light show? Like Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon type stuff?
I would imagine it's something like that. What I imagine is maybe some sort of and lots of people say it's sort of projection up on a side of a building.
Okay.
And there's that, like I said, an elementary school.
Yeah.
Next
And
to him.
pictures of him.
Right,
and,
pictures of him.
See
Hopefully,
you on the dark side of the moon.
I would imagine we're not going to have those lyrics.
This is how we can't have nice things here, Ross. This one right here.
Hello, exactly.
It'll probably be Thaddeus Stevens quotes.
Yeah. Okay. That's better. That's better.
That's probably better.
Okay. So, but light show and then continue.
And then it moves over to Gettysburg, where we're going to have also seminars, and also we're going to have a big dedication, with people speaking and so on and so forth. I hope we're going to be able to block off that part of the block of Baltimore Street. I don't know. That probably.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you could do that. They've done it for other things.
Sure.
Yeah, why couldn't you do that? Yeah, absolutely.
And then
if not, we'll just put our cars in front of the intersection and
We'll all break down at the
Yeah.
same time. Oh, flat tires.
there you go. We'll all get flat tires at the same time, same spot.
So, and then have a banquet at the Gettysburg Hotel, which actually is right next to where his house or his
Office.
law offices were when he served
So
here.
where were his law offices back? Like, what would it be today?
Right now, there is a room at the Gettysburg Hotel called the Stevens Conference Room,
Right.
where his initial law office was. Now, as far as his house in Gettysburg, where he moved to once he started making some money, that is on Chambersburg Street, across from the Christ Lutheran Church. There's a Thai restaurant in that.
Oh yeah,
location
yeah.
at
Oh,
that
he lived
time.
there.
There's a
He
lease
lived
on
there, but his house was torn down in the 1920s.
Oh, so that's not the original
not
building.
the original house.
What, Veronica?
I'm sorry. There's one of those blue and gold like wayside
Right.
kind of markers right there. that marks
Historic
it.
Oh, okay.
markers.
Yeah.
I never read those. Okay. Now, so you're saying back to where his law office was, the hotel, bought the building next to it, which was once a bank, and you
Right.
can go and there's a bank vault in
Right.
the banquet room there. And so you're saying it would be basically behind that banquet room where the bank used to be. Now the hotel part of the building, there's a meeting room back, conference room or something back there called the
Right,
Stevens room.
yeah.
And so his office would have been on the footprint of the conference room or the bank. Like the bank wasn't there when he was there, right?
No,
Right.
it was a hotel.
Okay.
It was like McLean.
McClellan.
Yeah, McClellan.
Yeah.
McClellan's room, and he was sort of in like a building to the back corner.
Okay.
Of that.
So it was all configured. That area was configured differently than what we see
Right.
today, obviously. Yeah. Okay. So got it. Okay. Continue now
Yeah.
with.
So anyway, we're going to have a banquet at the Gettysburg Hotel. We're going to have seminars here. Hopefully, we can get national known historians to come, and I hope that we're going to be having fireworks instead of a light show for for the end. And then on Sunday, the 3rd. By the way, his birthday is on April the 4th. But we
okay.
don't,
So we're coming up on that now.
that's right. In
Yeah.
fact, today, tomorrow, we're having a special Zoom event where the author of the new biography of Thaddeus Stevens will be talking to about 100 Thaddeyites.
Is that what you're called?
Some people.
Well, I might become
some
a
people-
Thaddeite.
Some people have called us Thaddeyites. But in any case, this year, because of the pandemic and everything, we're not, having an in-person event. Usually, we do have a pretty big event every birthday.
Okay.
I was hoping that we were going to have something big this year for the release of
Well,
this
you're
book.
on this show. Although
Okay.
this won't come out for a couple of weeks, but still.
Oh, it's going to be a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
But in any case, after the fireworks. Oh, and I also want, and even if I have to pay for this with my own money, we're going to have a billboard that says "Happy Birthday, Thad." and have his picture up there, which everybody loves his picture because he has such a sweet disposition.
Yeah. You should put that out on like one of the billboards on Route 15.
I was going to do Route 30 myself.
Oh, either one. Yeah, still, it's a big highway.
On the Lincoln Highway.
Yeah. On the way from Lancaster.
Yeah.
That makes more sense.
Or from the way from Caledonia.
Oh, either way. Yeah.
Right. And then on the third day, we're going to be out in Caledonia for a tour of Caledonia and a brief business meeting of the Thaddeus Steven Society.
Do you think how hard do you think it would be to get at least from Lancaster to Caledonia renamed as the Thaddeus Stevens stretch of the Lincoln Highway?
This is a great idea.
I do too, because that's his
I'll put that on my list of things to do.
list of mountains to move.
There are a lot of things that we need to do, like for instance, his first iron mill, which is actually in Fairfield, the furnace stack is actually still there. Really? Covered with trees and vegetation.
Oh, like it's just ruins back in the woods?
No, it's actually right on the road. It's
really?
It's like right next to the railroad tracks, and it's not back in the woods.
Where it's not on 116.
No, it's on Iron Springs Road.
Iron Springs Road, okay. I've never been on Iron Springs. I'll have to go check it out.
Well, you can't see it because it's covered with vegetation.
Oh, so you got to know where to look.
Yeah, well, it is in back of the only church on Iron Springs Road. And if you just look at it, it'd just be like a big clump of trees and weeds and such like that. If you get closer, it's a pile of rocks in a cone shape. But that's the way they made iron stacks, iron furnaces at that time.
So it's behind the only. Don't tell us any more, because this is like an adventure. We're gonna find the only church on Iron Springs Road, and then go from there.
So I mean there are things like that need to be reclaimed, and of course that takes money.
Sure.
His childhood home in Peacham, Vermont, still exists. And it's now vacant because the person who was living there died, and it hasn't been taken over for back taxes because it hasn't been vacant that long. And so we have to do something about that. His mother's home is up there also, but that's, people are living there, and but it still could be used. We should have some sort of historic easements to protect it.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things we need to do. And a stretch along the Lincoln Highway would be great. I mean, in fact, you could call it the Thaddeus Stevens corridor, and it could stretch from from York to Caledonia.
Yeah. Right.
And you can have all of these different things. In fact, we do have on the internet sights to see in Lancaster, and also sights to see in Gettysburg. And going back to why I created the Thaddeus Steven Society, one of the things I wanted was to have somebody who could satisfy the curiosity of people who learn about Thaddeus Stevens and are impressed with him, and then go someplace and don't find anything. But now they have someplace to find something. Yeah. And I remember a couple summers ago, getting a call, because my number is on the webpage or on the website, about Gettysburg sites, sort of like Veronica, and it says, by appointment only, you can see this Thaddeus Stevens exhibit at Gettysburg. And there was this woman who had seen the Lincoln movie, then read a biography of Thaddeus Stevens. She lived in Washington State, okay. And she was vacationing in this area. She called me up and said, "Oh, can we see the Thaddeus Stevens thing?" And she came in, and she was just so appreciative of all of this information. I think Veronica was talking about how this is sort of, the Thaddeus Stevens shrine. Sure. That you can, you see letters written by him and newspaper articles about him. I mean, I think people, we have newspapers, copies of the New York Tribune, one of the largest papers at this time. When he died, they devoted their entire front page to him. So he was really huge at that time.
Yeah.
And for a lot of different reasons. One of them being the real success of the Lost Cause campaign afterwards. He was basically delegated to, obscurity. And I think you also have to understand, you were talking about the way people view different things. I think after Reconstruction, it became sort of a given in American society that anybody who really believed in equality was crazy, because they went around, saying that the black population was naturally inferior. I mean, if you go back and read the old newspapers and magazines, the racism was so casual. I mean,
it was like it was just a scientific fact. They would just state these things.
And I mean, it's kind of amazing to me, and I tell this to younger people who are shocked to hear this, that a childhood nursery rhyme that I grew up with, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," was a racist thing,
Yeah, it wasn't always a tiger.
No.
And I always wondered, because tigers don't have toes. So how does this work?
So they have claws or something like that. And he was relegated to a person that was crazy. And now, we're getting to the point, we're not getting to the point, but hopefully we're past the point where that is, is accepted that people should be treated equally.
Yeah, hopefully.
He was always a trailblazer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even back then, he was almost everything he advocated for. We finally have, hopefully, as
Right.
you said. I mean, it would be nice to think that we're equal and we all see each other equally and everything, but almost every single thing he advocated for, whether it was public education, whether it was anti-slavery, whether it was equality, whether it was black voting,
women's rights,
exactly.
Central bank,
everything you looked at, he was.
He set the agenda for the next 150 years.
Yeah, I would say that.
Yeah. And we've been fighting ever since. Thanks, Thaddeus. But he did, though.
Maybe we can get to the point where, we appreciate what he did.
I like the way you framed it, where he is like the founder of the refounding of the country, or however you said it.
Second founding, thank you.
Because you're right. The first founders set out these ideals for us to strive towards.
Right.
And we're still doing that. But he kind of just clarified it with the second founding, and he's like, okay, and this is how we can achieve some of those ideals from the Declaration of Independence. Right. You've got to make the blacks equal, and you got to give them the rights to vote, and let's cut this crap with all these different banks. I can't believe the bank situation. I didn't realize that. I knew that they had banknotes, and I knew that states had their own currency too, right? Or was that a colonial thing?
I'm not so certain about the states. But
the point being, there wasn't one national currency.
No, there was no national
that united
currency.
Everybody. But I didn't realize that you had to have like an exchange rate card to see, the Bank A. $1 at Bank A is not $1 at Bank
B.
Exactly. That's insane.
That was insane.
How the hell did we grow at that point?
But you have to understand also that you did have coins of, like $5 coins and such like that. And you could,
and it had to be worth its weight in gold, all this stuff, right? Is that how that worked?
I'm not exactly sure how that worked, but
how did it work?
Does he know?
Do you know?
Well, it wasn't based off of the weight of the coin.
Well, I didn't literally mean, you don't say worth your weight in gold and literally mean that. I'm just saying it was representative of something tangible.
Well, it was something tangible. It was they were struck from gold or silver.
No, not the coin, the paper.
The paper, as far as the greenbacks during the Civil War, they were not backed up by gold. Actually some were and some weren't. That was sort of a big dispute. But Thaddeus Stevens basically just wanted to have what's called fiat money. But I believe there was I think bonds to the rich people were backed up by gold, but the paper money was not.
Okay.
But that all changed, when people were going on the gold standard, off the gold standard, and so on and so forth. That was a big issue. Interestingly enough, and I hate to bring this, I shouldn't bring this up, but I'll bring it up anyway, talking about being ahead of the time. He also, implemented the first income tax too during the Civil War.
Is that he's the guy we got to thank? Well, now I don't like Thaddeus Stevens.
That was the necessary war measure.
Yeah. Well, right, and then they got rid of it when
The Supreme Court declared
done.
it unconstitutional, and then it came back in 1916 after they passed an amendment to the Constitution. So that was under Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah. Great.
Thanks, Wilson.
Thanks. Yeah. Son of a bitch.
But the talking about being ahead of his time, he also, if they had adopted the original 14th Amendment as Thaddeus Stevens had proposed it, you probably would have had women's votes 50 years before the passage in 1920 of the 19th Amendment. And what he wanted, okay, this is a little complicated, and I hope that I make this clear. Under our Constitution, before, at the beginning, representation by congressmen was based on the number of people in a state.
Right.
Okay. Which included people who could not vote, like slaves and women. Okay. And of course, there was the famous 3/5 compromise, which is very misunderstood because actually the slave owners wanted the slaves to be counted as whole people. And it was the compromise with the North to reduce it to 3/5, so that the slave owners didn't have more of an advantage than they already had.
Right.
Okay. But women were counted as whole people, but had no vote for representation. Thaddeus Stevens had this idea that we just base representation in Congress and in the Electoral Congress on those people who could actually vote. Okay, you following me? So that would mean that if that had passed into the Constitution, smaller states would have said, hey, we can get more representation in Congress by giving the vote to women.
Okay.
And so then there would have been a competition among the states because everybody wants to have a lot of representation in Congress.
Sure.
And so that would naturally spur the states to give women the vote so that they would stay even with other states. That was obvious to the people who were considering this, and that was like, oh, that was terrible. We're not going to be able to give women the vote. In fact, they were so crazy about it that they stuck into the 14th Amendment the word male to make it clear that they're not giving this, they're not considering women in this. And in fact, that was kind of outrageous to Thaddeus Stevens that this was going to be the first time that they were sticking male into the Constitution. There is no male in the Constitution before the 14th Amendment. And he actually, made kind of a joke out of it. He said, now, I don't quite understand why there's an objection to women. I mean, none of the bachelors in Congress have any problem with keeping it out. It's only the married guys that seem to have an objection to having, women considered.
Yes. They're sick of being overruled.
Yeah, but he actually said he was going to vote against the amendment because of that. But then he came back and said, never mind. I'm going to vote for it because it's the best thing I can get,
right.
at this time.
Yeah, it's one step closer.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but he did consider the women. He probably could have pushed harder. I mean, a lot of feminists at the time were pretty pissed off that they didn't get considered at that time.
Yeah.
And he probably could have pushed harder, but he was definitely for women's voting.
So, way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
But he set the course for us for sure. He died when?
In 1868.
Of what?
Back in those days, he just sort of died of old age.
Yeah.
I've heard that it's possibly liver cancer or something like that.
Was he a smoker or drinker?
Not much. He was a teetotaler. In fact, he was a believer in the temperance movement and such like that. So that wasn't a big issue with him. I mean, that was sort of a low grade issue until after abolition and such. As far as smoking, I haven't come across anything where he smoked. But you also understand in those days, smoking involved cigars.
Right.
There were no cigarettes.
Right, or pipes, or
Yeah. And so he wasn't big into that. But he died at the age of 76.
Yeah, it's a pretty good
run
for that time, especially.
Yeah.
He dies in 68, so perhaps he's kind of forgotten because the 1870s, there was so much that went on in the 1870s with Reconstruction and with westward expansion. That kind of, like the war ends and it's just everything's going west. We're fixing the South. There's all this stuff going on. The nation's growing, and maybe the nation didn't have enough time to look back just a couple of years and say, hey, that Stevens guy that just died, he was a pretty interesting guy, because they're too busy looking forward and moving. And maybe that's part of the reason why he kind of got forgotten. And then when he was remembered, it was W.D. Griffith making a or D.W.
Well,
Is it W.D. or D.W.?
D.W.
D.W. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the lubricant WD-40.
I think that's very charitable to look at
okay.
it that way.
Okay.
I think it was more intentional to, I think during that, you had Reconstruction and you had, 10-year period where the southern states were being more equal and with the military in there, basically to keep people from being shot and such.
Yeah.
And then you had, of course, the aftermath of Reconstruction, where the South just basically came in, or the white Southerners came in and just reclaimed the politics by violence.
Yeah.
If they didn't win elections, they just killed the person who won the election. I mean, they made no bones about it. And and then they started rewriting history through the lost cause. But I would say Thaddeus Stevens was remembered, during the time he was right immediately after he was after he died. I mean, he laid in state in the Capitol Rotunda, an honor given only to Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Up to that point.
And he was guarded by black soldiers then, wasn't he?
Right, the Black Honor Guard. And 20,000 people attended his funeral in Lancaster when he was buried. And I just want to read you a little quote from Frederick Douglass.
Sure.
This is in the new book, and then right on the front page it said, Frederick Douglass said, there was in him, Thaddeus Stevens, the power of conviction, the power of will, the power of knowledge, and the power of conscious ability that at last made him more potent in Congress and in the country than even the president and cabinet combined. So he was well known. And as far as there's a couple different reasons that he isn't well known. And one of the reasons would just be the way that we teach history in the United States. It's all about presidents, and a lot of presidents don't even get, how many people know about Millard Fillmore?
Right. James K. Polk.
James K. Polk, that's an interesting point. That's another thing. He probably was one of the most significant presidents. He basically conquered the whole United States.
Yeah.
And so
nobody knows his name.
Yeah. But
It's amazing.
And he was only president for 4 years.
Yeah.
But during that time, he doubled the size of the United States to the size that it is now.
Yeah.
Outside of Alaska and Hawaii.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, Thaddeus Stevens had a role in getting Alaska. So that's
really
he did. Yeah, he was instrumental in approving the proposal by Seward to buy Alaska in 1868.
Wow.
So you could actually say he's the father of Alaska also.
God, what didn't that man have his hand in? That's awesome.
A lot of different things. And he also was instrumental in the creation of the state of West Virginia, too, because that broke away from Virginia.
Well, he can't win them all. No offense, West Virginia. I'm teasing you. It's a
I'm
beautiful
sure a lot
state.
of the West Virginia people are going to come running in here.
They're going to hate me now, but I'm kidding. I love to go down there.
But in any case, I think that so congressman, because that's all he rose to was congressman. He wasn't even a senator.
Yeah.
Don't get any coverage in history.
Yeah,
I mean, they're always sort of just lumped in with Congress did this. They don't say this was the person motivating,
Right.
Congress. And
Well, I think because Congress always, ever since they started polling, has always polled less favorable than herpes. So I mean, I think that's just part of it. Is you just.
But in this case, in the case after the Civil War, you had a president who was not supported by the North, at least. And it basically was Thaddeus Stevens that prevented him from really mucking things up. I mean, it would have just been so different if he hadn't had Thaddeus Stevens to prevent that. But getting back to why, we don't cover the congressman, and actually the fact that Thaddeus Stevens has 3 movies where he's in it is kind of unusual. No other congressman, good or bad.
What are those movies?
Birth of a Nation, Tennessee Johnson, and of course Lincoln.
Lincoln, okay. And but like you said, Birth of a Nation, he's not Thaddeus Stevens. He's a different
Austin
character.
Stoneman,
Austin
but it's a powerful congressman in Pennsylvania,
and it looks like him.
Yeah, it looks like him.
Yeah,
sounds like him, so on and so forth.
Although the there's a picture here. I'm looking at the Wikipedia, and they have a picture of Thaddeus Stevens from A Birth of a Nation, and it's a scene. It's a shot where he's talking, and Lydia Smith is there, and she looks like she's crying. Of course, she's all in blackface.
Right.
But there's a picture of Lydia Smith, and she looks like a white woman.
She is.
Yeah. It's like, what? I don't understand this. Like, there's nothing. Yeah, that's weird. But it says she's light-skinned, but I don't see it. But I don't know. It's a black and white picture anyway, so it's hard to tell.
As you well know, back in those days, there was the one drop idea that
high yellows.
Yeah,
is that what they call them? Yeah, those are awful names. They I forget what it was, but I someone had shown me federal like classifications of so like what is a high yellow and a quadroon and an octoroon and all these different terms for how much black blood you had in you. And that was federal, like official federal. It's unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. To us, it's unbelievable to us. But like in the history of the world, the way we think is, it's like as thin as a sheet of paper in the timeline of, everybody's always been horrible. And we're you know what I mean? Like, name one people in history that hasn't been horrendous to another people. I can't think of one. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there was some really great. Well, they're probably dead. The really nice people have probably been wiped out.
Actually, that reminds me. Actually, I think the Dutch might come closer to what you're thinking about.
Okay, the Dutch.
And
well, wait a second. Didn't they start the international slave trade?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Actually,
I don't think the Dutch are so.
Now that you mention it, the 1619, just remembering from Virginia history, it was a Dutch ship that was blown off course that had a bunch of slaves on it in 1619 that got it started in Virginia. But comparison, I guess, because I remember, like, everybody knows the Pilgrim story.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't remember, they didn't come directly from England.
No.
They actually went to the Netherlands.
Yeah.
To escape religious persecution. And they left the Netherlands because the Dutch were too tolerant, and they were teaching their kids toleration. And they said, "Oh, we can't do that. We want to burn some witches."
Right.
And so they set off to America, where they were free to burn their witches.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
man.
that's also a crazy thing in world history is witches.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's just sort of, let's just make up something, and then accuse people. And
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible.
yeah, but you're right. In fact, this is Eric Foner, who's a famous historian,
Yeah.
particularly with Reconstruction history, in a documentary about Reconstruction. He makes the point that Congress was really amazing during that period when Thaddeus Stevens was in control, because they basically tried to create a biracial democracy in the South. And as he said, it was a tremendous leap in the dark that had never been done. There had never been, a multiracial democracy in world history.
Right.
So you can give people like Thaddeus Stevens a lot of credit for that. Obviously, it really didn't last, after the troops were, pulled out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at least it was tried,
It was.
And things could have been a lot worse if Johnson had had his way and the Southerners had basically taken their seats in Congress.
Yeah, that I can't imagine. That's insane to me.
Yeah, it was a real turning point, December 4th, 1865. They turned the corner.
Although, I was just listening to the Joe Rogan podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
A little bit. I've heard about it.
But he had some lady on who's written several books about different secret government programs and stuff. And one of them is about Operation Paperclip. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Basically, after World War II, we took a lot of top Nazis and what's his name?
Werner von Braun.
Yes. And a couple of there's a few other ones who were given prominent positions. One of them was actually convicted at Nuremberg, but not to hang, like he was a lower level, but high up. Actually, I think he was commandant of one of the labor camps at Auschwitz, and he was convicted and sentenced to jail. But we got him out because he was also like a top virologist or something like that. No, he was the head of the Nazi medical program. He was the Surgeon General, basically, of the Reich. And under him, all of those experiments with Dr. Mengele and all that stuff, took place. But he was an expert on immunizations and vaccines. And so we're like, well, we could probably benefit from him. So we plucked him out. And it's one of those weird things. It's like, well, do you want to be ahead? Because now we have to worry about beating the Russians.
Right.
And the Russians are taking some old Nazis too. So, there's all these horrific things that they did. But does that mean you can't learn from what they did?
Sure.
Those experiments and all that stuff. It's like, well, it's kind of disgusting. But what came out of it? What did they learn? And so we co-opt these people and bring them in. And so I guess it's not so weird that the ex-Confederates would be, in Congress or elected to be a governor or something like that, because it seems that's what we do.
Some of the ex-Confederates.
It's like, so what'd you learn
actually
fighting
reformed.
us?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Some
go
of the
ahead.
ex-Confederates did learn, Longstreet.
Yes.
Actually sort of made peace with the Union, and as a result, he was demonized by the ex-Confederates. Interesting, just sort of an interesting little aside about Werner von Braun for your audience. He was a rocket scientist that was invented the V1, V2 rockets, which hit London after the Germans ran out of airplanes to bomb London. And anyway, he was made the head of the space agency for the United States afterwards, and I think he was still around at the Apollo mission, maybe, or shortly before that. But anyway, he was very big into the rocketry of the United States. But anyway, he wrote a book after World War II because he always was talking about how he really wanted to, build rockets to go to the moon. And the book was entitled, I Shoot for the Stars. And some comic at the time said, yeah, and the rest of it is, and sometimes I hit London. So, yeah, I mean, there are, moral decisions you have to make, like, for instance, with Thaddeus Stevens, he could have said, I'm not going to approve the 14th Amendment because it, screwed women. And, but he said, this is the best I can get. I don't believe, a lot of people sort of portray him as being unbending, but he bent all the time, to get things
You have to.
through. Yeah, to get things through.
You can't be a successful anything if you don't
Politician,
bend.
particularly.
Yeah, specifically. But I mean, you've got to bend. You got to give a little to get a little.
Yeah, but the key thing about why they were able to do so much after the Civil War was because the Southerners were out, and they basically had free. They didn't have any opposition or as big an opposition as they had before the Civil War.
So after Stevens ignores the Southerners there and doesn't call roll, and it's basically just the Northerners. And Reconstruction goes down the way we know it to go down. They did have to have elected representatives. So how did that work?
Well, what happened was, and this is an interesting, and I got to tell you this: the 14th Amendment. Okay, Congress passes the 14th Amendment, and Thaddeus Stevens just wanted to have the states that were still in the Union to approve it, but other congressmen thought, well, no, we got to have all of the states approve it. So they submitted it to the southern states, and they all said, no way, we're going to approve the 14th Amendment. And so it came back, and so Congress said, okay, fine. Then they put them under military control, okay? And they said, in order to come back into the Union, you got to approve the 14th Amendment. And they also required that they give black men the vote. And then they had to hold conventions where they would rewrite their constitutions. And then the constitutions were submitted to Congress. And depending, what they were, they had to get approved by Congress. And then once they were approved, they were let back in to Congress. And this is when you had black congressmen, black senators.
Right, that's what I was getting
in
at.
there.
Yeah.
And some of the states, were very liberal down in the South as a result of that.
But were those black congressmen and senators, were they genuinely elected by those states, or is it because of the military situation and the federal meddling, for lack of a better word, that they were elected? Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, when you had the military in there, it ensured that blacks could vote.
Okay.
And there were certain restrictions on some white voters that they couldn't vote because of their participation in the Civil War. I think the people who had actually sworn oaths to the federal government were disenfranced after the Civil War. But a lot of Southern whites, of Southern whites could vote. Some of them boycotted because the blacks could vote. And so I would say that those people were elected because there was a huge participation by the black population.
Okay. Which was ensured by the military presence.
Right.
Got it.
There were more blacks in South Carolina than there were whites.
Sure.
And still, that's why Georgia went blue this time, because there was more people voting, also more blacks voting, because they had loosened up the voting restrictions down there. So I would say it was because of the military control, which allowed more black participation.
Okay. Because I've heard some lost causers point to that as, well, we had no problem with blacks and everything like that. But I was like, well, I don't think you guys genuinely elected them. And so what you're kind of saying is, if it weren't for the military there, they might not have been elected. Or that's not what you're saying. I'm putting words in your mouth. Is it fair to say it that way? That if the military hadn't been there ensuring that the blacks had the right to vote,
Right.
would those black senators or congressmen that were elected have been elected?
Probably not. If the Southerners had still been in control,
Right.
they would have suppressed the black vote.
So to those lost causers that make that argument,
Right.
you weren't really electing those people.
Yeah, I came across somebody who was saying, "Oh, it was only because they wanted to keep the Republican Party in control." Well, the Democratic Party wasn't going to be representing black interests at that time, so they only had the alternative to the Republican Party, and so that made sense at that time. So, I would say. You could say that it was because of the military control that they had these people voted, but it was because they allowed the blacks to vote that they were able to be elected.
Right. All right. So people want to maybe join the Thaddeus Steven Society.
Oh, wow, great.
I don't know.
That.
How would they do it?
Oh, it's extremely easy. All you have to do is Google Thaddeus Steven Society. Or you could, go to directly to our webpage, which is ThaddeusStevenSociety.com. And on the front page, there is a link to contact information and membership. And you just click on that, and you can either join online. You can get out your credit card and join us online, or you can copy the form and send it into our address, which is Thaddeus Steven Society, Post Office Box 3484. That number again is 3484. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and there's only one zip code in Gettysburg, which is 17325 or 17325. Whenever anybody gives out information on the radio or television, I think, Jesus, they're giving it out too fast. I gotta give it to me again so I could write it down.
And you can donate through PayPal right there on the homepage. There's a donate button. So I encourage you all to do that. And there's some pretty cool things here. Who was Thaddeus Stevens? Calendar of events, membership and contact info, Thaddeus Stevens quotes, newsletter, a whole bunch of stuff. Go and check it out. Ross, thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you.
This was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun.
You'll have to come on again because I'm sure there's more we can talk about with Thaddeus Stevens.
Maybe a year from now, closer to our Thaddeus Stevens Fest.
Oh, yeah. Let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I got to mention one other thing. One other thing next year that I'm planning on doing. In July of that year, I want to try to start the first annual Second Founding History Festival. And then this is in my mind, and it depends on me getting enough support for this, but it would be like a block party, which would have history organizations, social active groups, and food vendors, of course, in the first block of Stevens Street in Gettysburg. And there'd be lectures and such like that. And there would... and it would celebrate the passage of the 14th Amendment, or the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which occurred at the end of July in 1868. Okay. So it's to sort of, popularize the idea that this was a second founding.
Yeah, I like
1868.
that. I like that idea. I like the way to let's figure out how to do that then. Let us know if we can help you in any way, get the word out or something like that, or whatever. Let us know.
Oh, maybe I'll come up with a plan or something like that.
Maybe you will.
Okay.
Anyway, Ross, thank you very much. It was great having you on.
It was a lot of fun.
It's Ross Hetrick, ladies and gentlemen, from the Thaddeus Steven Society. Sorry, I cut you off. What do you want to say?
No, that's all.
Oh, okay. You didn't want to praise me for anything?
No, thank you for such a wonderful program. I think this is good. Everybody should listen to this.
I'm just kidding.
Pay for it. That's all.
They're already, they're paying for it already. Poor fellas and ladies. No, all right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for your support, and we will talk to you next time. Okay.
Oh, that was a lot of fun.
That was fun. Wow, he is an interesting guy.
He was. I mean, it's just, it's